Good morning. I hope my points this morning are not too repetitive, and Tim told me I had 2 minutes and Therese told me I had 10, so I figure that means 5 or 6 minutes. And it's hard to crunch it all into, even 5 or 6 minutes. I was asked to speak to the Abbots of America, the Benedictine Abbots of America, this past February. And Father Cyprian at Big Sur was the one who invited me, and he said, "You pick the topic." So what came to my mind is something I've been thinking about for 15 years, and that's the question of Sacred Humanitas, because in the year 2000, Pope John Paul gave a talk to international Benedictines and said, "I urge Benedictines in particular to develop Sacred Humanitas." And I know of very little writing after that from the Benedictine world about what Sacred Humanitas is or what it might mean to us. So I'm kind of reinvigorating that whole question and asking, and I'm not so sure the term Sacred Humanitas is even serviceable because it's so strange to people. But I think whatever is behind it is exceedingly important, not only for the Benedictine and monastic world, but for the cultural revival of the West in particularly, and for creating a global civilization of love and meaning and so forth. And so I have a friend up in Albany, New York, a Mercy sister who's now retired, and when I told her I was speaking to the abbots about, she said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Sacred Humanitas," and she said, "Try to explain what that is," and I tried, and I said, "I don't know why I didn't choose a bigger topic." As I said, I guess what I'm talking about is where we stand in history, Now, I'm supposed to do that in 2 to 4 minutes, but I think that's a really important question. Where do we stand in history? Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man, the German title is Das Pfeil der Humanitas, the arrow of mankind. And where are we on that tip of the arrow? Because, the tip of an arrow or the nose cone of a rocket is where you have a lot of fire and tension and light, that's where the friction is. But it's the growing edge, and that's really what concerns me. What's the growing edge in our society, for good and bad? But I think Sacred Humanitas deals with this question of how do we bring a humanitas rooted in the sacred to that question of what's on the tip of the arrow. Where are we headed in terms of mankind and the future and so forth? So what is the challenge before us? Where do we stand in human history? So just to return to the Benedictine world a bit, the term Sacred Humanitas doesn't appear in the classic literature, and yet it is being somewhat used. The person who particularly has used it is Michael Casey, who's a Trappist from Australia, who has been using it a bit in his writings. And I had the opportunity to meet with him in Boston briefly in May. He gave a workshop up there, and he recommended looking in some of his books and so forth. And he said, "Well, why don't you find out who wrote that talk for the Pope?" Because, the Pope has ghostwriters. He can't write everything. And I thought about it later, and I thought, I think he wrote it. And I think the writers of the Pope's speeches are not supposed to claim, what they wrote. So if I get another chance to talk to Michael Casey face to face, I think I'll find out. But one of the things that Michael Casey said is that there is about the rule of St. Benedict a pervading sense of genial humanitas. And that word genial is, I think, wonderful. Because genial means warm and human and down to earth and daily and so forth. It's not an ideology of humanitas. Because as I said last evening, I think Benedictines didn't reflect very much on that. but it's all through the rule, the way in which Benedict talks about the way pilgrims are to be treated, and the poor and the elderly and the young and so forth, how even the alienated are to be treated in the monastery. Okay, so there is about the rule of Benedict a pervading sense of genial humanitas, and I think that's very important. All right. There's only one place in the rule that Benedict uses the term humanitas, and that's in the chapter on hospitality. And Leonard Doyle, when he did the translation that's the oldest common English translation in America, done at Collegeville back in the probably 60s, Leonard Doyle's translation of that phrase, humanitas, he defines it as the courtesy of love, the practical courtesy of love, which I think is a wonderful way of translating it, okay? But it's very interesting that Benedict used the term humanitas because he was obviously thinking of the classic way it was used in Greek and Latin civilization, particularly by an author like Cicero. It was a cultural ideal for Cicero. But there's a new book which Father Michael Casey particularly recommended to me. It's a bit tough, but I would say it's worth your reading. And I think it's a very important book, which I hope to see more and more acclaimed. It's called The Rise of the Individual by Larry Siedentop. He is a teacher at Oxford, historian, been there for many years. It's really an apologia for the way that the gospel and Christianity has shaped Western culture. Now, we haven't always done so well. You know, we only got rid of slavery finally in the 19th century. And yet, there is this yeast that's been working through Western civilization. And I would say that one of the great coded DNAs, patterns of Western civilization, is the Benedictine cultural component, okay? That's there as kind of a yeast. They recognize it much more clearly in Europe than we do in the United States. And I had a guest at our monastery a few years ago, a woman from Austria. She was in her early 30s, and she got out of the car and she said, "Sister, I was raised in rural Austria on a farm." And she said, the Benedictines did the irrigation systems and the orchards, you know, and the nearby flour mills and the schools and so forth. And so Benedictine values thoroughly penetrated parts of Europe, okay, even though Europe has its own variety of secularization. Okay, so what is Sacred Humanitas? And as Tim said, I'm still searching to define it. But Sacred Humanitas is a sense of humanity and the common good and the worth of the individual and so forth that's rooted in a contemplative culture, whether it's Islamic or Jewish, you know, or Christian and whatever. So it's a huge umbrella term, all right? And as I said earlier in my talk this morning, I'm not so sure it's a serviceable term. It needs to be popularized and explained and so forth. But I would define it as a deep cultural disposition and sensibility that recognizes the worth of persons and the common good and helping each other and so forth. And that's what Pope John Paul was urging Benedictines to revive in their tradition and continue, because we've had it in our tradition. You know, as I heard an abbot say recently, he said, Benedict tells us not only to welcome strangers, but to welcome the strange. That's a wonderful way of doing it. All right, so it's a deep cultural disposition or sensibility, all right, to be truly honored. I'd love to give you some examples of hospitality from the Islamic tradition. I just don't have time to do that, but it's so much part of these ancient cultures, you know, to honor. NPR had a story I have to tell you about a couple years ago of a war going on someplace in the Middle East between two groups of Muslims, different points of view. But because the rule of hospitality is so ingrained in them, they would welcome the enemy into their homes for the night, and then they'd leave her in the early morning and be fighting each other. It's just unbelievable. Okay. So one of the things I mentioned last night is a phrase that the medieval Benedictines and Cistercians picked up from Proverbs chapter 1, that wisdom cries in the streets. And that's where we have to pay attention. Where is wisdom crying in the streets in our day and age? What are the issues? What are the world events? What are the human tragedies and so forth calling us to pay attention? Particularly, where are the creative insights? You know, Thomas Merton said, pay attention to the artists. And Father Bruno Barnhart, the now deceased previous prior from Big Sur, said, pay attention to poets. You know, it's just interesting. These people tend to be on the creative edge. You know, they're the distant early warning system, you know, for what's both tragic and significant. So look at how important people like T.S. Eliot and so forth have been. So wisdom cries in the street. What are the strands? When I spoke to the abbots, I called it the sutras. You know, what are the threads that meet together that we can weave to create the world of meaning in our day and age? I'd like to just conclude with a quotation from Ursula King, who is a Teilhardian scholar. She says, we may be in the early stages of forming a new world society, or perhaps even a new world civilization. The question is, how do we bring Humanitas into that, and what would be its nature? Which will be as different from today's society as post-industrial society was from human life in the preceding millennia. We are experiencing a decisively critical stage in the history of human consciousness and culture, with fresh opportunities for shaping new insights and attitudes to the world as a whole. That includes our natural, social, and cultural worlds, as well as the worlds of our imagination, creativity, and spirituality. What is most urgently needed is the attainment of wisdom. So wisdom, for me, is another way of talking about Sacred Humanitas. Deep wisdom, spiritual wisdom, which must feed the will to practical action in a world so deeply torn apart. Such wisdom can only be nurtured by the inner development of each individual. That's why I said last night that interiority is the key, that depth and wellspring of spiritual insight that flows over into practical action and works and so forth. And the concomitant deeper transformation of our communities through the radical restructuring of our political, legal, financial, and educational systems. So I brought up quite an agenda. Throughout history, religions have attempted to foster such experiential and social wisdom, but the religious heritage of humankind is tainted by an incriminating record of injustice, tribalism, violence, and the violation of fundamental human rights. At the same time, the world faith also possess a rich store of spiritual resources. The precious heritage of vision and empowerment. However, a simple return to or retrieval of past spiritualities is no longer enough to meet urgent contemporary social and personal needs. A new kind of spirituality is needed for the cross-cultural, mutually interdependent context of a new global society. And I believe whatever we call it, this new Sacred Humanitas is integral to it. So thank you.